You know, I name it data enrichment because it has so many names, right? People call it feature engineering, data wrangling, data transforms, but it's all the same thing, right? You're just trying to not work from the same data set that your client gives you, right? I see this mistake constantly where people say, "Oh, we got the client data. There's 30 columns. That means we have 30 features to work from." No. That's just the base set, right? Once you do your transforms and your enrichment, you might have less, but typically speaking, you should have more than that, right? I mean, I know it's all data dependent and all that, but if you're just saying, here's 30 columns from the client, here's my 30 columns that I'm doing features on, that is terrible, terrible data science, right? Because you completely have missed that enrichment and the feature engineering and all that. So yeah, it's all this. It's all the same term in there, Zeneb. I just call it data enrichment across the board. Good question. Good question. Anybody else? There's a lot happening on this chart. But again, this is going to be our guiding light towards everything that we want to do. So Leo says, when it comes to data collection, pipelines, etc., what are the technical tools relevant to master? SQL, maybe? SQL doesn't hurt, Leo, for sure. It's helpful. But remember, and this is another thing that, again, not a lot of schools teach. And I wrote this in my book, right? Data in the real world, particularly on the collection side, tends to be very messy. It's the messiest when it comes from multiple sources. Because directly to your question, Leo, excuse me, SQL does help, but it's very, very rare where you're going to be on a problem where they tell you, here, we need to work on this, and here is the single SQL database where the data is held. Like, that's basically, the case only like 25% of the time. The more likely scenario is here. We need, here's the project, and half the data is in SQL. 25% of the data comes from these PDF reports. 10% of the data is over in this SAS database, and and everything else we need is a CSV that we get from a vendor. Like that's a much more common scenario. It's never a straight line. I shouldn't say never. It's rarely a straight line to just be able to say, oh yeah, sure, here's the data, go to it. Like that just doesn't happen. So yes, SQL is important, but so is Pandas, so you can read the CSVs. Or maybe the data is coming from an API, so you're gonna have to know how to work that API. You're gonna have to know how to read PDFs, in the PDF libraries. So it's a variety of things, Leo. It's a variety of things. So SQL doesn't hurt, but it's not the only thing you need. So I hope that's clear. But yeah, it helps, but it's rarely the case where, oh, I just wrote some SQL queries and now my pipeline is done, right? Or if you think of it this way too, right? Like time is also an important factor, because with SQL, basically you can just say, well, the queries are kind of self-updating because I run the query and the data is there or it's not. Well, what if it's a PDF that arrives every other day, right? How are you going to account for that? Or it's a PDF that arrives every other day, but you also got to account for holidays because the vendor doesn't send the report out on holidays. Now you got to account for that, right? So yeah, it's messy. It's messy in the real world. But that's why it's an entire step, right? Like data collection is never just like a one day task that you just check off on your list, right? If you have to name 3 important tools to have in hand, what would they be? You really can't. There's too many, Leo. It's really just more about you having a flexible mindset, right? Like, I mentioned PDFs, CSVs, and APIs, right? Well, you can do all that in Python, but you're going to need different tools in Python, and there's different ways to do that. There's a million libraries to read PDFs, a million ways to access an API, right? So it's really more about you just having like that flexible approach, like that can-do approach. And you're going to need a couple of Python skills. But there is no, here's the top 3 tools for data collection. It makes for a great Instagram reel, obviously, right? But the reality is that it's more about your mindset to have that flexibility to work across tools and sources. Osama says, is ideation a process of creating, generating ideas to address specific problems using data? Yeah, Osama, sure. It's either about how to address their problems or new ideas that you can give them, right? And that's really the hope, right? Because yes, the client's always going to have their ideas of what they can do with their data. And that's good, right? But the real win, where you really win the contract, is where you can say, I hear you on your ideas, and here's 2 scenarios where we could solve your ideas. But guess what? Our team went to work, and we also found these other 3 things that we can help you solve. And we're confident we can do that, because of our experience, because of our methodology, so on and so forth, right? So it's a little bit of both of those, Osama, right? In other cases, neither one of you may know what's possible, right? You may not know the client's business enough. And maybe they don't know data enough, right?